Hello and welcome to Hey Ask Me Stuff. I'm Ken Coughlin coming at you from Trinity Lutheran Church in Joppa, Maryland. Oh, look, we've already got some comments for the BA. Must have put those in there earlier. I didn't even recognize that. All right, there we go. Well, our nested chat is obviously working. So anyway, hi, my name's Ken Coughlin. I am a Christian apologist, like I said, coming at you from Trinity Lutheran Church in Joppa, Maryland. Welcome to Hey Ask Me Stuff. If this is your first time watching the program, let me tell you what it is all about. In fact, this is about viewer-driven. It is a show where you get the opportunity to ask me questions. Sorry, two things at once here, and there we go. It's entirely viewer-driven, so you submit questions that you would like to see us answer on a future episode, and then I answer those questions. And sometimes we have some other special guests on, things like that. Yeah, how do you do that? Here's how you do that. You go here to this website, trinityjoppa.org/askmestuff. And on that website, you will find a form that you fill out. You put your question in there. It can be anything about the Bible, Christianity, Jesus, God, world religions, philosophy, I don't care, whatever, anything that's kind of generally under the Christianity umbrella related, then throw it in there. And then we look through those questions that have been submitted, and each week we pick one to be our topic for the week. So go do that. Get your question on so that we will answer it in a future episode. Hey, thank you for thank you those of you that have already subscribed to our YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, now's a great time. Go ahead, click subscribe, click that little notification bell so you don't miss out any of the great content we've got going on. Said before, we're trying to get up to 2,000 subscribers. I think as of I checked earlier today, I think we were at 1562, I want to say, 1562. So I think we got about, 438 to go to reach that goal. So, if you can help us out, if you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and do that. If you have subscribed already, well, tell someone else to do that, whatever it may be. Get that, help us reach that goal. And comment on our videos, all that kind of fun stuff. Hey, if you are watching us live, we are live every Tuesday night at 6:30 p.m. You are invited to be part of the program, and the way you do that is by commenting in the live chat. As you can see, is already on the screen. Did the BA tell me he was doing this? I don't know. He's got these automatic things coming up. Pretty cool, BA. I like it. But as you can already see on the screen, there's some chat appearing on there automatically. If you have a question to comment about anything that I say here this evening, throw in the live chat right here on the YouTube channel. It'll appear on the screen. It'll appear on my screen over here. I'll be able to see it, and we'll be able to interact. Tell me if you think I'm right. Tell me if you think I'm wrong, whatever. If you're not watching us live, you can still do it. Just go onto the comment section below the video when you're watching it, and let me know what your thoughts are there as well. So that being said, let's get on to what our question of the night tonight is. And our question is, how do you like being back to school? No, that's not really it. But I thought I'd mention that since this is the first week back to school for most people here in Maryland. And I got to see some of my students from last year showing up for the first day of their first school day today. And not all the faces were enthusiastic. It's almost like they like summer break. But anyway, no, that's not really our question. Our question for the day is there proof that God exists? This is one that a lot of people I've seen come up quite a bit. And we could talk about this question for, the next 6 months if we wanted to, but the program can't be that long. My wife's going to want me to drive her home eventually, and that will probably get her very, very mad at me. So we're not going to do that. But I'm going to, in the 30 minutes or so that we're going to be on the air here, I'm going to do my best to try to give as complete of an answer to this question as I can in that time. And I'm going to start out with this. Is there proof that God exists? Well, it depends on what you mean by proof. All right. And that's not a cop-out. I am going to get to some of the evidence and everything later on in the show. So stay tuned for that. But we have to address that first question, the first issue. What do you mean by proof? If what you mean by proof is, can I put certain things out in front of you that's going to convince you and show you to 100% certainty that there's no possible way it can be false, to 100% certainty that God does in fact exist, and specifically the Christian God does in fact exist. No, I can't do that, and I'm not going to pretend to be able to do that. But here's the thing, and I'll say this. I have seen and interacted with a lot of non-believers over the years who, whether they openly acknowledge that's what they're demanding, as a practical matter, that they are demanding that. They're refusing to believe, so they say, unless you can basically give them 100% certainty. Don't leave any room for doubt. And where that really comes from is they start out from a place of having a naturalistic worldview where they kind of assume that that God doesn't exist, and then you only and so that the kind of the lens they look at everything through. They assume there's a world where God doesn't exist, and so they look at everything through that lens. I mean, you'll hear this expression sometimes. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so the existence of an invisible, omnipotent being is an extraordinary claim. So you, Christian, need to provide extraordinary evidence in order to support that claim. I mean, that saying's a bunch of baloney. I mean, extraordinary claims do not require extraordinary evidence. Extraordinary claims, just like any other claim, just require the type of evidence that would be appropriate to show that claim. Real quick example, the winning of the lottery. The claim that you hold the winning lottery ticket is an extraordinary claim. If we were to look at that claim statistically, it is astronomically more probable that you hold a losing ticket than that you hold a winning ticket. And so you make the claim that you hold a winning ticket. Now, does that mean we need to have extraordinary, some type of evidence that's heretofore unknown and never been seen in the history of evidence to really back up that extraordinary claim? No, we just got to see the winning ticket. It's the type of evidence is not any different than what we would otherwise expect. It's just that it has to be the right evidence. It has to point to the conclusion. And so this whole idea is just an example of what I'm talking about, where a lot of skeptics kind of try to set the bar so high that it becomes very, very clear that they'll never. It doesn't matter what you show them; they're never going to believe. They're starting out with a mindset that nothing, already kind of predetermining that nothing you can show them is going to convince them that God exists. So they're just not going to believe that God exists. Great. And in fairness, I've interacted with some people that openly admit that, and that's great. And good on them if they openly admit. I will ask them, well, what type of evidence could I show you that would convince you that God exists? And lots of times the answer is nothing. There's no evidence that would convince me that God exists. Okay, well, great. At least you're upfront about it and you're admitting it, as opposed to others who claim to be reasonable, but then they start piling on these requirements and imposing these unreasonable requirements upon evidence for Christianity that they don't require anything else in their lives. And that's where it gets to be unreasonable. It's not all the skeptics, but it's a lot that I've interacted with. So I can't do that. Or if you're coming to this show expecting that I'm going to be able to show you 100% certainty the existence of God, you're going to be disappointed. All right? I can't do it, and I openly admit that I can't do that. I will also point out, though, that is not the level of evidence you expect anywhere else in your life. Literally, you operate on your day-to-day existence on the assumption that certain things are going to go the way you expect them to go, even though you can't be 100% certain that that's what's going to happen. Case in point, those of us that are old enough to have a driver's license, you ever driven in a car? You ever gone on a plane? Can you tell me to 100% certainty when you get behind the wheel of a car that you're not going to get in a car crash on the way home? No, but what do? You still step out. You still take that step. You still get in that car. You still drive it. Even though you can't have 100% certainty, it's not going to be the last time you're driving a car. So we live our lives based upon what is reasonable for us to believe, or sometimes what is necessary for us to believe, even though we can't know anything in life to 100% certainty. So no, I can't show you God exists to 100% certainty, but you don't require that in any other aspect of your life. So if you are expecting that level of proof of God, then you're being hypocritical. I mean, you're being a hypocrite. You're demanding one level of proof for God that you're not demanding of anybody else. So what can we do as Christians? Well, we can, I believe, show, and we'll get into the difference between knowing and showing here in a minute. We can show that it is reasonable to believe in God, and I believe more reasonable to believe in God than to disbelieve in God. And specifically, I'm talking about the Christian God here, that it is certainly the more, given those two alternatives, Proposition 1, the Christian God exists, Proposition 2, the Christian God does not exist, it is the more reasonable of those two propositions is Proposition 1, that the Christian God does in fact exist. Now, again, that's not going to be showing you to 100% certainty, but it is showing to basically the same level of certainty that you hold a lot of the beliefs that you hold in your life. And this is, by the way, this is what Christians mean when we talk about faith. A lot of people, skeptics, will say, well, Christians just believe in blind faith. We want you to believe even when there's no evidence whatsoever to support your belief, but you have to believe it anyway. That is not what Christianity means by faith. And it's funny, I can't tell you how many times I've been like, I want to pound my head against the wall because I'll be interacting with a skeptic and they'll tell me that's what faith means. Faith means belief in not only with lack of evidence, but it means belief in spite of the evidence. Even if there's all the evidence is against you, Christianity requires you to have faith, which means you got to believe it anyway. And I tell them, no, that's not what Christians mean by faith. That's not what the Bible means by faith. And it's like pounding my head against the wall because here I am talking to somebody who is trying to, not even a Christian, but they're trying to tell me what I as a Christian believe. And I'm like, I'm the one that's a Christian in this conversation. I think I'd be the better authority here. I'd be the one to know. And so I'll tell them, no, that's not what Christians believe. And they say, yes, it is. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No. It's like, seriously, how would you feel if I did the same thing to you? Okay, here's what we're going to do then. I'm going to tell you that all atheists believe the Christian God exists and should be worshipped. And you could say, well, no, that's not what I believe. Well, tough. I'm telling you, that's what atheism means. So it doesn't matter what you say, even you, the atheist, say. I'm telling you, that's what atheism means. I mean, obviously, if the tables were turned, you'd see the utter ridiculousness of that. But I many, many times I've had people insist the contrary to me. So what does Christianity mean by faith, and why am I bringing it up? Faith, a good parallel word for faith in Christianity would be trust, all right? When we're told to have faith in Jesus, when we're told to have faith in God, we're basically being told to trust him. Essentially, what it means is, look, God's given us enough information to justify that trust, but not 100% certain information. We're never going to have enough information to bring us to 100% certainty. And so he's given us enough to justify showing trust in God. An example I give sometimes when I'm teaching is when my son was younger, he would, he was probably like, I don't know, 2-3 years old, something like that. And we have we have a multi-story house. And so you walk in the front door and there's a set of stairs right there that go upstairs. And he would love to jump off those stairs and have me catch him. A lot of kids do things like that, right? Well, I remember one time I didn't know he was standing there. And I'm walking up to the front door. So the stairs are kind of, when you walk to the front door, the stairs are kind of behind you. And as I'm walking up to the front door, all of a sudden I hear, "Daddy!" And I turn around and there's my son already in midair jumping toward me. All right, arms outstretched, hey, catch me, Daddy. I did catch him, thankfully. Well, my son, when he took that leap, had faith in me. He had faith that I would catch him. He trusted that I would catch him. It wasn't blind faith. Why do I say it wasn't blind faith? Because he'd done it a million times before. And every single time he'd done it before, I'd always caught him. So he had a basis on which to trust me that I would catch him, but he couldn't know with 100% certainty, of course. That's biblical faith. So biblical faith does not require 100% knowledge. As a matter of fact, it assumes we cannot have 100% knowledge, but you have enough information to justify taking that leap. All right. So I mentioned a minute ago that I would talk for a second about the difference between knowing God exists and showing God exists. And this comes from William Lane Craig, Dr. William Lane Craig, Christian apologist. And it's a really good mindset to have as Christians now. And now I'm talking to any Christians that might be out there watching. When we are talking about this whole apologetics thing, this whole thing of, defending our faith to the world. I never want to make it sound like when I'm engaging in these philosophical conversations that I believe faith is purely a thing of the head. Pastor Reese this past Sunday gave a great part of her message where she was talking about, ultimately Christianity isn't about what you know, right? It's not head knowledge, all right? God doesn't just expect you to know stuff. He wants you to have faith in him and to obey him and do stuff and not, you don't earn your salvation by doing things, obviously, but he wants you to live out your faith. And so I never want to make it seem like when I'm making these arguments that I'm saying that you can just purely by creating these philosophical arguments, you can all of a sudden make someone have faith purely as a result of their intellectual assent. In other words, you talk to them, they intellectually agree with certain things you say, therefore, ta-da, now you're a Christian. It doesn't work that way. There's conviction of your own sin, and there's the work of the Holy Spirit and all of that. And so William Lane Craig says there's a difference then between knowing Christianity is true and showing Christianity is true. We know Christianity is true through the internal witness of the Holy Spirit in our heart, right? Through God's grace, he sends the Spirit into our heart, which convicts us of our sin and enters into this relationship. We have a relationship with God. So I've often said that, somebody coming to me and trying to tell me that God does not exist is almost basically like you trying to tell me my wife does not exist. I'm going to look at you cross-eyed because I know my wife. I spend every day with her. I talk to her. We have a relationship. And so for you to tell me that God does not exist, it sounds just as wackadoodle because I have a relationship with God. That's how I know God exists, right? But I can't give you my heart in the sense that I can't make you feel what I feel. I can't make you privy to those conversations, per se, with between me and God. And so there's, in addition to knowing God exists that way, there's still ways we can show God exists. And so one thing there's a passage I want to show you here real quick. How do we show God exists? What does this mean? Well, it's this, all right? Romans 1:20 says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." If you look at this, what does this tell us? It tells us that if we look at the things that God has made, in other words, his creation, the world, the universe, right? Then we will be able to see evidence of his invisible qualities. We will be able to see the invisible things about the invisible God are made visible, at least in some sense, through his creation. It's kind of like if you look at a painting, all right? You can tell something about the painter through their work, through what they've created, all right? The same is kind of true here of God. We look to his creation, all right? Now, so how do we go about doing that? What is the role of if I just look at a tree, how does a tree, show me the invisible qualities of God, so to speak? Well, you combine evidence with argument, with reason, with rationality. Again, this is just to show God is true, not to God exists. We're not talking about knowing anymore here. All right, so I'll give you an example. For those of you who don't know, I'm also an attorney, and I've been a practicing attorney for a pretty darn long time now. I don't do a lot of it anymore. I just do stuff here for Trinity. But I've been in a number of court cases since I got my original license in 1998. A number of jury trials, and the way a jury trial works, or frankly even a bench trial, but we'll just talk about jury trials for right now, is you have certain stages that the trial goes through, and the first stage is here. Let me do this here real quick, so you're not boop 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 the whole time. Here we go. So the first stage of a trial, you kind of, after jury selection, you pick your jury and all that. Trial begins with opening statements. All right. So the two lawyers come up and they each get to address the jury and basically tell them what the case is all about. All right. Then what happens next is each side presents their evidence. So like in a criminal case, for example, the prosecution will then present their evidence. They'll call their witnesses. They'll bring bring all the pieces of physical evidence and get them admitted. And then once the prosecution is done presenting their evidence, then the defense comes up and they get to present their evidence. And then you have closing arguments. Closing arguments are where the lawyers kind of define, explain what that evidence is supposedly shows, what it all adds up to. And the reason that's important is because any piece of evidence is kind of irrelevant without an argument showing why it supports the conclusion that the lawyer wants it to support. Take the example of a shell casing, all right? A bullet shell casing, all right? So if you have a bullet shell casing sitting on the ground, in and of itself with nothing else, it's meaningless. It's just an object. It's just a thing laying there, right? It's a shell casing sitting on the floor. But now, first of all, we combine that shell casing with some other pieces of evidence. So now we combine that shell casing with the fact that it matches a bullet that was found in the victim, the size of the bullet that was found in the victim. And then we find out that the accused, the defendant, has a gun, a firearm, that matches that size caliber, that caliber weapon for the bullet. The shell casing all fits the size caliber gun weapon that the defendant has. And then, of course, you pile on more pieces of evidence and more and more and more. Again, individually, all of these things are just kind of meaningless facts. They're not going to get you there by themselves. But then what the lawyer does in closing arguments is they weave them all together, and they show how, if you look at all these pieces, they all lead to this conclusion. I need to create the argument as a lawyer to show you why all of this evidence leads to a particular conclusion. If I'm the prosecuting attorney, I'm trying to get it to show, to lead to the conclusion that the defendant is, in fact, the murderer and committed the murder. All right? I did want to tell you a real quick story. I had I can't remember all the specific details. I had a case, a jury trial years ago, and all I remember is that it worked out to a math problem where, I mean, this is not the exact math problem, but pretend this is what it was like. I had, we had some piece of evidence that was like in quantity of 5, and then a total quantity of 7, and whatever it was, the quantities were, I don't remember what they represented. But the case, what we didn't have is we didn't know for sure or have direct evidence of what that second number was. But we did have evidence of what the first number was and what the total was. And the other side, the attorney on the other side, had agreed with these and had conceded these points. And I just remember I stood up in my closing argument at the very end, and I had a big one of those big notepads you write on with a marker and everything. And I wrote the math problem out on the board. I wrote it kind of like this, like you see on the screen, where it's like 5 plus blank equals 7. And I looked at the jury and I said, I'm no math genius, but I can figure out what goes in that blank. It's really a simple problem like that. And it's one of those moments where you're just like, yeah, I just won this case. I just absolutely won this case. But again, the purpose of the closing argument was to do exactly that, right? The jury had been presented with evidence over the course of this trial of whatever the 5 represented and whatever the 7 represented. But they might not have remembered, and they might not have realized, because they might have been separated, these pieces of evidence might have been separated by several days, in the course of the trial. And so they may not have realized the ramifications of that. So then I came up and I presented an argument, or in this case, a math problem, to show them the conclusion that this led to, in which case it led to the conclusion that my client should win, and my client did win on that one. So apologetic arguments work basically the same way, in the sense that we can, and this is again how we show God exists. We can show God exists through arguments that are supported by evidence, all right? And so there's evidence we can point to out in the world that we then fit in, we kind of demonstrate, we show, well, this is true, and this is true, and this is true. Now let me show you this argument based upon all these things we've just shown to be true, and show you the conclusion that it comes to, the conclusion that God exists. And there are, like I said, plenty of arguments that lead to this. Now, I cannot, in the time we have left, shoot, it's already 6:55. Look at that. Well, I might go a little over half an hour tonight. I can't go over every single argument for the existence of God to answer the question, is there proof that God exists? But if you understand what I've explained so far, I'm going to tell you there are a lot of arguments that work just like that. And I'll give you a few examples. But you've got things like well, let me bring this one up right now. This is one I've talked about a number of times before. It's called the Kalam Cosmological Argument. And again, I don't have time in one show to go through all of these arguments and show you how they provide proof in the sense I've been talking about. Not 100%, just enough to justify taking that leap of faith that God exists. This argument says, premise number one, anything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise number two, the universe began to exist. And the conclusion is, therefore, the universe has a cause. And so this is an argument. This was kind of like the closing statement, the closing argument that a lawyer would make. And so I would then point to evidence to support premise one and premise two. For example, anything that begins to exist has a cause. Well, we could point to the fact that that is our universal experience, right? That if you have, if I walk home today and I look on my kitchen counter and there's a peanut butter and jelly sandwich sitting on the counter in my kitchen, I am not going to assume that it just spontaneously popped into existence. I'm going to assume that somebody went to the pantry and the refrigerator and took out the ingredients and assembled them into a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. All right, we're going to assume that something caused it to be there. All right, that is our universal experience. To support premise number two, the universe began to exist. There's all sorts of things we could talk about with that. I mean, I know Christians will disagree about, Big Bang theory. I'm just bringing it up because it's one way you could go about this, where you could say, even a skeptic might agree with the Big Bang. The Big Bang happened. Well, if the Big Bang happened, that meant the universe began. That's what the Big Bang points to, a beginning point of the universe. And there's all sorts of other philosophical points we can make to prove this premise. But that's what we do. We take these pieces of evidence to support the premises, and then we look at the argument, and we say, well, look at that argument. If premise one is true, that anything that begins to exist has a cause, and premise two is true, that the universe began to exist, what's that mean? That means the universe is one of those things that is considered anything that falls under the category of anything in premise one, right? Therefore, the universe has a cause. And the Kalam argument goes on to kind of explain what else we can conclude from that about the cause, that it was an intelligent cause and all of that. I'm not going to go into all of that necessarily right now because we don't have time for all of that. Let's see that. I'm not going to do that argument. Let's do this one. Wait, come here. There we go. Let's do this argument. The moral argument. This is another popular one. The moral argument for the existence of God says, premise number one, if objective moral values and duties exist, then God exists. Premise two, objective moral values and duties do exist. Conclusion, therefore God exists. What does that mean? Objective moral values and duties just means things that are true regardless of opinion. All right, so a moral value is kind of like a quality, like to love, courage, perseverance. All right, that is a moral quality or a moral value. A duty is an obligation. All right, so when I say you ought to love your neighbor, all right, the love is the moral value in that sentence. The ought is the moral duty. I'm telling you, you ought to do it. I'm saying there's an obligation upon you to do it. And if moral values and duties exist, regardless of our opinion of them, all right, that we all live this way. We'll get to that in a second. But if the objective moral values and duties exist, then the only way they can exist is if God exists, if God is the foundation for them. And I give the example this way lots of times. Let's say that, Joe Schmo is walking down the street, minding his own business, and then evil Mr. Schmidt jumps out of an alleyway and punches Joe Schmo in the face. All right. Well, Joe Schmo turns to evil Mr. Schmidt and says, I think you were legally wrong for punching me, so I'm going to sue you. Now, evil Mr. Schmidt may disagree with that and say, no, I think I was legally okay. I was legally allowed to jump out of a random alley and punch you in the face. And so they disagree. They go back and forth. Well, what's going to happen? They're going to go to court, and the judge is going to open up the law book and see what the law says. And the law book is going to say, no, evil Mr. Schmidt, you were legally wrong for doing that. You need to pay damages to Joe Schmo. Now, and so there is a source, even though they each had a different opinion about what the legal conclusion should be, there was an objective source, meaning a source that's independent of their opinions, that's above them, that transcends them, to use a big fancy word, that they have to obey, that determines what the right answer is. And that was the law book, right? You look in the law book, it says, Evil Schmidt, you were wrong. Joe Schmo, you are right, regardless of what you believe to be true. Well, we just change that example a little bit and say, well, instead of them disagreeing about whether they were legally right or wrong, instead they're disagreeing about whether they were morally right or wrong. Is there a moral law book above them that determines, regardless of opinion, who was really morally right, who was really morally wrong? Or are we just stuck with our two opinions? That there's nothing to judge between. Mr. Schmidt says, I think I was morally right. Mr. Schmo says, I think you were morally wrong. Is there any way to judge between that? Even if we can't necessarily recognize it correctly all the time, does in fact a law exist, a moral law to determine between the two of them? We all assume one does. I can't remember who it was who said it now, and it's bugging the heck out of me that, well, I know C.S. Lewis said something along these lines. I can't remember exactly how he put it, but the point is that even the most staunch moral relativists, in other words, even people who will say outwardly to you that they think that morality is a matter of our opinions, will change their tune quickly when their wallet is the one that is stolen. They're not going to listen to somebody say, oh, well, I thought I was morally allowed to steal your wallet. And it's like, no, you're not morally allowed to steal my wallet. It was morally wrong for you to do that. Give me my wallet back, right? And so everybody lives their life as if we really do have this objective standard above us. And that's evidence, all right? That's another piece of evidence that we put into this argument, this moral argument, and we show that if then that is true, and if the other premises, or premise one is also true, then the conclusion that comes from it is that God must exist. The only way we can have a moral standard that we all are expected to obey, regardless of our opinions, is if there is someone above us who's transcendent to us that can be the source for that moral standard. Again, so that's another example of proof for the existence of God. Let me see if I can get, I'll just show you this one real quick. I'm not going to go too much into it. The teleological argument. Premise one, the universe is either designed or the result of chance, natural law, or a combination of both. Premise two, the universe is not the result of chance, natural law, or a combination of both. Conclusion, therefore, the universe is designed. What this one basically says is, hey, look, the universe can only come about in a couple different ways. There's only a few logical possibilities. Either some intelligent mind, God, right, intentionally designed it to be the way it was, or it came about as a result of chance, meaning just random chance, or natural law. In other words, are there some laws that operate on this universe that guaranteed it had to be the way it is, or maybe a combination of both of them? And then premise two says, well, we can rule out chance and natural law. Those are not based on the evidence. That's not the way the universe came about. And then that's another place where we put evidence into the puzzle. We look at things like the laws and constants that govern the universe, and we see that they are set to such a high degree of precision that it just boggles the mind to think they got that way by chance. And there is no natural law that would require them to be that way. And there's no way we would accept in any other circumstance this happened by chance. You know, any other time you see something that defies the odds to such a great degree, we naturally think someone designed it. Somebody did it that way on purpose. It's kind of like if you're walking through the mountains and you see a bunch of stones on the side of the trail that spell out your name and then say, welcome to the mountains. And that's the way the stones are arranged on the dirt. Are you going to think that they just happen to randomly fall that way? Or are you going to think that somebody deliberately placed those stones that way? Obviously, you're going to think they deliberately placed the stones that way. Well, surprise, surprise, the odds of the universe being the way it is by chance are astronomically worse than those stones falling that way by chance. So that's what's called the teleological argument, or the design argument. There's another one. Let's see here. This is a neat one. This was from C.S. Lewis. It's called The Argument from Reason. And this has to do with our thinking, basically. And it says, rational thinking is reliable only if it is based on recognizing ground-consequent relationships. And this is talking about, can you reasonably draw conclusions? You know, from we use logic, we use reason. What can we trust the conclusions that our mind comes to? And And C.S. Lewis says, well, in order to do that, we need to be able to have what are called ground consequent relationships, have our brain recognize ground consequent relationships or draw conclusions based on ground consequent relationships versus cause effect relationships. Cause effect is if you have a certain input that goes in, you're guaranteed to have a certain output that comes out. All right. And atheism, basically naturalism, which says the natural world is all there is, says everything is just a cause effect. So everything that happens in the universe happens as a direct result of some cause that caused it to. It's a guaranteed result. We may not be able to always be able to recognize all of the causes, the butterfly effect. We may not be able to see how everything is going to spell out, but that's just our limitation. But if we were omnipotent or omniscient enough, we could theoretically see that when you have a certain number of inputs, when this happens and this happens and this happens and this happens, we know that this result is going to come about. This is what's going to happen next. That's naturalism, all right? But the problem is, if that's the case, then, and we're also just the result of these natural causes, the determined causes, then our thinking is this, our brain works the same way, right? That you may think that you've rationally evaluated evidence and arrived at some conclusion, but in reality, you haven't, because everything that happens in the universe, including your thought process, is guaranteed based upon what inputs it receives. So you can't trust any of your conclusions. You can't think that you're actually reasonably, rationally evaluating evidence to see if it actually supports a conclusion or not, because what conclusion you arrive to is completely determined by what you've been exposed to in your life up till that point. That's a basic summary of what the argument from reason says without going through all the philosophical mumbo jumbo on that. That's a good one. That's another big one. And I'll close with this one. This is one last good example. It's called the argument from proper function. And it says this: if organisms have a proper function, they must have been designed by a rational being. Premise 2, organisms have a proper function. Conclusion, therefore, organisms must have been designed by a rational being. This is from Alvin Plantinga, philosopher Alvin Plantinga, and he asks this question: how do we know, take the heart, for example, the human heart. Well, what is the proper function of the human heart? Well, we would say to pump blood, right? Well, he says, well, but it also makes a thumpa-thumpa sound. How do you know that the proper function of the heart is not just to make a thumpa-thumpa sound? And it just coincidentally also happens to be pumping blood. Are you just arbitrarily picking one of the things it does and saying that's the proper function? Or is there a way to actually identify that? An example I've given is I have a stove at home. When I first gave this example, this was true. Now the clock on it is completely dead. But it has a little clock on the top of the stove. And when I first gave this example, that clock, all of the lights on it were lighting up. But that was precisely the problem. All the lights were lighting up. So literally it was like four digital eights across it all the time. And that's all it showed. Well, was that clock working properly? Well, we would all say, I think reasonably, no, that clock wasn't working properly. Well, why not? Why do you say the clock wasn't working properly? I mean, all the lights were lighting up. So clearly all the lights were functioning. Well, yeah, Ken, but that's not the purpose of a clock. The proper function of a clock is to tell the time. And so regardless of whether all the lights are coming on, if it's not telling time, then it's not functioning properly. It's a broken clock, right? Well, how do you know the proper function of a clock is to tell time? Well, because you look to the person who made it, right? And the purpose for which they made it. The creator decides the proper function. The watchmaker determines that the proper function or the clockmaker determines the proper function of a clock is to tell time, not just to light up all the lights that are on the display. Well, that's true of what's called artifacts. Artifacts are, physical things that we make here, or that are physical here on Earth. What about organisms, living beings, all right? We use the same type of language when we're talking about living beings. I just gave you an example. You will look at a human being and say the proper function of their heart is to pump blood. But don't you see what you're doing the moment you say that? You're essentially assuming that a human being has a creator, because that's how you determine what a proper function is. All right. We all kind of innately recognize that. That's why we use this type of language to say we know when a heart's not functioning properly because it's not pumping blood. When it is pumping blood, it's properly functioning. When it's not pumping blood, it's not properly functioning. And so we kind of use the same language that we do for things, for those artifacts, which again is just one more piece of evidence that God does in fact exist. And again, I could go through these in a whole lot more detail. There's a lot more stuff we could talk, but we don't have time. I'm not going to, obviously each one of these arguments, you could spend, matter of fact, we've got a series here on the YouTube channel. It's an older series. It's called Pocket-Sized Apologetics, where I have like it's not on the homepage anymore. So you'll have to go to the playlist tab and kind of dig back through the history to find it. But it was a series of videos I did several years ago. The idea was all of them would be around 5 minutes or less, short little snippets, but they kind of walk progressively through some of these arguments. And so if you want to explore some of these in more detail, I'd encourage you to go to that playlist and you can kind of look at some of these arguments in more detail. But in answer to the question then, is there proof that God exists? I think the answer is as long as we define proof the way I've talked about, where we're not asking about 100% certainty, all right? We're just saying that it allows us to draw a reasonable conclusion, and frankly, a conclusion that is more reasonable than its alternative. All right, it is more reasonable to conclude based on the evidence and the arguments that God does exist than that God does not exist. In that case, I say yes, there absolutely is proof that God exists. All right, and if you were to dive deeper into any of these arguments I've given, or even more, there's plenty more I could have gone into, then I think that is the proper and reasonable conclusion of those arguments. Now, is that how we know that God exists? Through these arguments? No. This is how we show that God exists. And I do believe that God does use the Holy Spirit, all right, during these discussions, so that we may be having a conversation, and perhaps you start to recognize through hearing some of these arguments and seeing some of this evidence that, oh yeah, that actually sounds reasonable. I think God does exist. I didn't previously, but now I think maybe I do. Well, great. The Holy Spirit, that's the Holy Spirit's work, not the apologists. In other words, I don't take credit when someone acknowledges an argument that I presented, because I know darn well that they're never going to acknowledge the truth of an argument I present unless the Holy Spirit first softens their heart and makes them amenable to that. So it's still all the Holy Spirit's work, and God gets all the glory, which is why I say we know God exists through the internal witness of the Holy Spirit. But this is one tool the Spirit could use to help to reach someone, to indwell their heart, to get them to have that turnaround and have faith. Is it the only tool? No. I mean, if there's different types of people out there. For some folks, this is the way the Spirit's reached them. For other folks, they don't need any of this. They don't need any of this to have faith. You know, God has reached them in a different way entirely. And that's beautiful. That's great. That's a very diverse approach that God can take. And so we as Christians need to be understanding of that, and we need to kind of have all these different tools in our arsenal. If you are a person that didn't need apologetics, when it didn't have any apologetics presented to you when you came to faith, that's great. Don't diss those that do. And just like if you're someone who did have apologetics as part of your faith journey, then don't diss those who didn't. All right, God can reach different people in different ways, and that's the important conclusion. All right, so let's see here. That's the answer to the question. Is there proof that God exists? I think the answer is yes, as long as we're properly understanding the way to interpret that proof standard. Just a quick reminder again, if you forgot already, go here, trinityjoppa.org/askmestuff. Submit your question. We'd love to hear from you as far as what questions you would like to see us address on a future episode, maybe next week. Who knows? Fill out that form, get it submitted, let us know. And again, we are trying to get to 2,000 subscribers. So if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel yet, why are you waiting? Go, do it now, right now. All right? No, please, seriously, please subscribe. Please share this video, share the channel, tell other people about it. And if listening to these big, long 30 to 40 minute podcasts is not your cup of tea, go to our shorts feed on the homepage. You'll see where it says shorts. We've got a whole bunch of videos on there that are all 1 minute or less. All right. And so talk about micro snippets. This is also why I'm never going to bring back pocket-sized apologetics, because I don't think I need to. We've got this YouTube short feed genre now is kind of filling that need. And so we got a lot of shorts on there that are both, some apologetic stuff like this, and also just some excerpts from sermons that have some good life advice, some faith stories. So go through that if you really like that kind of that short attention span thing, and let us know what you think. All right. I think that's all I got here today. So I will thank everybody who has been watching. I see several of you have been watching as we go through. And just a quick reminder again, mark your calendar, Tuesday nights, 6:30 p.m. That's when we're live, although you can watch it after the fact too. But hey, it's more fun to watch it live, right? So put it on your calendar, make plans for it. Thank you all very much for joining us. Those of you who've gone back to school this week, God bless you. Have a wonderful school year. And if I don't see you all sooner, I will see you. I am preaching this Sunday. So if you're here, great. If you're not, watch it online. You want more, I'm going to be preaching on Who Turns Who. I think that's what I decided to call it, right? You want to know what that means? Tune in on Sunday, all right? If I don't see you on Sunday, I'll see you all next week right here at 6:30 on Tuesday. God bless.